Awesome. Okay, so that's clearly working. I'm glad so many people could be joining us from so many different places. Isn't technology amazing? Okay, so agenda for today, we are going to go through a few things. First is talking about depositioning competitors and how to do that. We're going to walk through some stories and examples of what we've done at Clue to learn about how to train our own reps on that. Then we're going to walk through some Battlecard basics. I'm going to share a framework that we use with our own clients on how to build really killer Battlecard content. After that, Vincent's going to take our theory and apply it and to show a couple of specific examples of Battlecard strategies that you can start building with exact how-tos on how to get started. So hopefully this will be a combination of both theory and strategy and then also practical execution. So regardless of what you're coming to the webinar for here today, you'll get a bit of both worlds, which I think should be valuable, hopefully. And then we'll do questions and wrap up at the end. Now, before we get started, let's introduce ourselves. My name is Katie Berg, Director of Marketing here at Clue. I've been here for about 3 years. Vincent is our VP of Product Marketing. He comes from extensive time over at Hootsuite, and what was it, SAP before that or something, Vincent? IBM after or before. So he's done both sales, product marketing at Hootsuite, as well as leading and heading up their competitive intelligence program. So really well versed on how to build a CI program from scratch, and specifically as well, obviously how to build Battlecards. For both of us, we've provided our LinkedIn links. Add us both. I know that for myself and for sure you as well, Vincent, we love getting feedback on our webinars. We love getting feedback or questions following webinars or ideas on other content that you'd be interested in hearing about in the future. So 100% feel comfortable to reach out to either one of us on LinkedIn after the presentation. That would be great.
Absolutely. Or reach out if we can help you in any other way beyond this webinar.
Yep. Great. So we are here to talk about building battle cards that salespeople love, because battle cards that salespeople love are really ones that will actually get used. And if you're managing a CI program or you're building battle cards, when battle cards are being used, what that's going to lead to for you is improvement in your competitive win rate, improvements and shorter sales cycle and higher average deal size. And those are some of the performance metrics that we've seen change for some of our clients who are running really successful CI programs and that have good quality content. So ideally, by improving your own Battlecard content, you can see the same results for yourself. I use this picture from Office Space because it feels really perfect to me when I think about where Battlecards came from. So Battlecards started at the birthplace of Battlecards, as if there's like a really formal history, but Battlecards started conceptually as a single-sided piece of paper that a salesperson would put up in their cubicles to use as a cheat sheet when a competitor came up in a deal. And, over time, because we had more information about our competitors, that single-sided piece of paper probably covered both sides. And then a marketer like myself got involved and I designed it to look fancy, or you possibly laminated it. And at some point along the line, we've turned this one-sided piece of paper into 100-slide PowerPoint decks that oftentimes are getting lost in network drives that no one's ever looking at, no one's ever using. So what we want to think about is what a battle card was originally intended to achieve. Battle cards are meant to contain short, concise, and easy to use strategies that a sales rep can use when they're selling against a competitor, or more specifically, to help them to answer the question, how do you compare to your competitor? Or said differently, how are you different than your main competitor?
Or how are you different?
Yeah, how are you different just in general? Totally. Yeah. We have, hundreds of product marketers and competitive intelligence people that signed up to join us in this webinar today. And I wish I could, but if I picked you and I asked you right now, turned on your video and unmuted you and asked you to share with the room how your company is different from your biggest competitor, what would you say? And you can't see this, and neither can I, but most of you are probably looking at me like this. And that's because this is tough. Answering this question and being put on the spot To explain really concisely how you're different from a competitor is not an easy question, but it is a question that your sales reps are asked every single day. And sales reps, I'm also meeting your SDRs, your BDRs, your account executives, your customer success team, any sort of customer facing people within your company are going to be asked this question.
I love this picture because it's so funny, but it's so true. Like this is how people will react. If there's an audio version of this, you'll also hear this. And then they start to try and blurb out some answer. And so this picture always gives me a huge laugh.
Totally, it's so relatable. And we all have defaults into how we answer questions when we're not super sure. Some might clam up, some might just start talking, even if it doesn't make sense. And actually that sort of leads into a really good story. So a couple of years ago, maybe like 2 years ago at this point, we got some of our sales people at Clue to record themselves answering this exact same question. So we wanted to get a sense of how as a company that does competitive intelligence, how are our own reps talking about our biggest competitor? So we got them to record themselves and we all sat in a room and we listened to them one after the other. And it was really interesting and a little bit shocking just to get a sense of how different their answers were. So like I said before, sometimes when you're hit with a question you're unprepared for, people respond in different ways. We had really long, sort of incoherent, maybe rambles that didn't make a ton of sense, and some concise answers. But it was also very apparent that our own salespeople, even with a small team, held vastly different ideas about who we are and how we were positioned in our market. So there was no consistent story in how we were different from our own competitor. And that was with a small sales team. Now, scale that out to 100 salespeople or 1,000 people or channel partners. And all of a sudden, as a product marketer or a CI professional who's trying to maintain some consistency and strategy about how you're being positioned relative to competitors in your market, it can really be a problem if there's no consistency in how you're being spoken about.
And sometimes it's not just salespeople too, right? It's anybody that's customer facing, anybody who's in a position to talk to customers, be it at an event, or even customer support people who are on the phone dealing with a customer saying something, about their competition and asking, well, how are you actually different from X? A funny story, it's actually also not just customer facing people. So part of my experience at Hootsuite has been that when I talk to even our executives, especially executives that have been coming on board, the question on, well, how are we actually different? You also get vastly different answers. So I think a lot of the starting point that we're talking about is for Battlecards to enable salespeople, but it extends well beyond that. Anybody that touches and have conversations with prospects and customers and even partners absolutely need to have a crisp answer on how are you different as a company.
That's such a good point. I can even speak from my own experience when we go to a lot of events, like in sort of heading up a demand gen function of a company. I go to events and I'm in conversations with people all the time who will ask very casual questions. How are you different than a competitor, or what makes you different? 100%, I need to have a statement and an answer that's going to be in line and consistent with the rest of the company. That's a great example, Vincent. So that sort of leads us to one who rose above the rest, and I'm going to embarrass her right now. This is Erins. She's one of our top performing salespeople at Clue. She has no idea that I'm using her in this presentation today, but I wanted to share sort of the approach that she took with her response, because it was the most impactful by far when we listened to them all in a row. So what was so great about her response? First, she started with a broad, high-level statement about how our two companies took different approaches to solving the same problem. So it was really concise, really simple, easy to understand. Then she supported it with a couple of key statements that basically spoke about our strengths as a platform and as a company, but weren't getting into feature specifics. And then she summarized it again, summarized that high level statement again, reinforcing that sort of simple and easy to understand positioning. So thinking through what was so good about this approach, and this is a bit almost like pedagogical when you're almost like from an education perspective, when you're teaching something new to someone, you start by explaining what you're going to teach them, you walk through the teachings, and then you summarize what you taught them at the end. This is kind of a similar approach that she took. Create the high level statement, make sure that it's memorable in order, in that it was simple and that it was concise, reinforce it with some supporting points, and then summarize again. So I really liked what she said. And coming out of this exercise, our question to ourselves was, how do we take what Erins said and now train all of our entire sales team to take the same approach and to use the same consistent message? And this to me is where Battlecards come in. Now, before we get into the actual specifics of building battle cards, want to get a bit of a sense from people on the call about how many competitive battle cards you or your team are responsible for keeping up to date. We'll give this a minute or two just to give you a chance to participate. This will be helpful for us. And maybe Vincent, I don't know if there's any questions so far, but we can answer maybe one or two if there are.
There is one that came in early, actually, which brought us to pull up this poll question. The question was, what's the ideal number of battle cards that a single CI person should be responsible for? What are your thoughts, Katie?
What is the maximum number that a single person should be responsible for?
We can answer both, maximum number and ideal number.
Ideal? I mean, okay, so I'll tell you what I think about when I'm factoring in certain things. I'm thinking, if you're managing or responsible for one battle card, it's not just the card, but it's also factoring in how frequently you're going to be updating it and how much work that is, how much work it is to collect the information you need in order to be able to update it. So to me, in an ideal world where you're able to update battle cards on much more than a quarterly basis, almost real time, you probably would, I don't know, Vincent, like you tell me, I would think with the amount of work involved, 3, is that absurd?
I don't think that's absurd. I actually would change the way we ask this question. I don't think it's a number of battle cards that a single person should be responsible for. I think it's a number of competitors that a single CI person should be responsible for. And the reason I say that is, if I think about a battle card, it's very audience intensive, right? It's very targeted to our specific audiences. A battle card that we would create for a salesperson would be very different than a battle card we would create for a customer success person, would be actually different from a battle card that we would create for a partner salesperson. So that's already 3 different battle cards. And so for one particular competitor, like I would want that one person, the single CI person, to definitely be responsible for all 3 of them. So the question is, well, how many competitors can the single CI person help tackle and realistically tackle? And that depends on how deep you actually go.
Because that, in examples that I've seen before too, there's one level of building a battle card on a competitor where there's maybe 1 battle card on that competitor, maybe 3, maybe a couple of different variations. Then there's a competitor that has multiple product lines, sells into multiple different segments or verticals, and you might be building a battle card for all variations of that, right? Which becomes much more time consuming.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's another question. Are you going to tell us more about the best, how do we compare speech, or was that just a teaser?
That's such a good question. It is sort of a teaser. Vincent, I don't know, maybe you have like a really good example of how to compare that you could share. Let me deflect that to you.
Let me think. My mindset right now is all about our current competition, so I'm not going to talk about that right now. I'll go back 5-10 years and just talk about our competition. Actually, no, I'll go way back, like 15 years ago when I was at IBM, and talk about the competition, right? So there I was selling Rational, which was a software development type of tool. And our competition at the time was very much centered around Microsoft and their development tools. And so our how do you compare speech was a case of, really, do you need the flexibility because your business actually seemed to be fairly complex, or do you have a fixed mode of doing things? That was the simple thing that we were always going to. Now, every single business is different. The key here that we always go to is, what is the simplest 2 or 3 words that is memorable that people can actually get attached to? Another classic one is usually the small business versus enterprise. Like, our competition whenever I was at Hootsuite used that against us as a company a lot, trying to paint us into a corner of SMB, even though we definitely weren't, right? So you end up doing a lot of defensive maneuvering when you shouldn't be spending time that way.
Right. This goes, actually, you've said something to me in the past that I found really interesting, which is like a part of the strategy of like your offensive tactics, or even in the way that you're positioning yourself. Basically, one of your goals when it comes to facing off against a competitor in the deal is to keep that competitor almost, your goal is for the competitor to have to be spinning their tires, answering the questions that you've seeded with the prospect rather than actively selling. And that's sort of the ideal position. If you have really strong competitive content and battle cards and your salespeople are really great at executing, they're going to be in a position to be actively selling their platform and solution to your prospects. And your competitor is going to be spending time handling objections, trying to overcome assumptions that the prospect has already walked in with, which isn't an effective way for them to use their time.
Exactly. It's about time management and making sure that you're the one that are having the real conversation with the prospect, and that your competition is just spinning the wheels and spending their time doing things that they don't want to be doing.
Are we able to get the poll results? Can you see them? Oh, here we go.
Oh, there we
10?
go.
Okay.
Wow, 10 or more. That's 45% of cases.
Okay. When I see that, I would also be curious to know a little bit of follow-up information around like
how many people.
Yeah, how many people, how often those battle cards are able to be updated, what depth of information search and curation is required to do that. Yeah, probably a lot of interesting conversations that come from
I was actually expecting the 5 to 10 to be the biggest response, the highest response, but apparently I'm wrong.
What are battle cards? Well, for those 3 people, we're about to walk through what battle cards are. Great. So before we really get into the real meat of it, I want to get some of the basics of battle cards out of the way, some things that we consistently talk about. So number 1 is that your competitive content needs to be up to date. The worst thing that can happen is a prospect tells your rep that the intel they're using is 6 months out of date. It's not relevant anymore. It's not true. The second that happens, your salespeople will never use your battle cards again. You've eroded trust with their prospect, and that's sort of the biggest risk that's ever going to face someone in a deal, is that like trust is eroded between them and their prospect. So super important that battle cards are kept up to date and that they're accurate. I don't know, Vincent, this is my opinion. I think there's a huge amount of trust building that needs to happen with CI and product marketing teams and their sales reps in order for content to be used. They need to trust it.
Absolutely. I always think about CI as a two-way trust. One is between your prospects and your salespeople, and then the second is between your salespeople and the CI team or the product marketing booster or something with CI. Without both of those trusts in place, then no competitive intel will be valuable.
Totally. Second is everything you provide needs to be digestible. So keep it clear and keep it concise. Your content should be easy to digest, easy to read. And you need to tell them exactly what to say. And this is something that we practice at Clue. But your battle cards should be written in a language that could be read out loud, and not kind of being really nuanced or confusing in your language. Just make it easy to understand and easy to access. Third is you need to provide proof. Of course, this is super important. That means showing where the intel came from, providing links to sources. We did a survey with salespeople a few years ago and didn't or at least I didn't, maybe know to the extent that salespeople want proof. And maybe this comes from not having a lot of trust with content in the past, or maybe having been burned, but you need to link to any proof points, any third-party validated proof points that can be shared. It can be common to share rumors or share innuendo that can happen, and some teams do that, but you really need to differentiate for your salespeople what is an unsubstantiated claim, something we're hearing, and what has been validated. So make sure to provide those proof points. The next one is, as marketers, put our marketing hats on and think like our audience. So you're writing for salespeople, write for your salespeople and not for your boss. If you've written your battle cards in a way that might sound really impressive or might sound really intelligent, it's almost like you've kind of missed the point. Battle cards need to be read verbatim. Use a natural language and use a conversational language in your writing. That's super critical to me. And lastly, make it easy to find. So don't make your sales reps dig in different tools or dig in different internets or dig on your drive to find your content. Make it accessible in the tools they're already in every day. So their sales CRM, if that's Salesforce, in their sales enablement tools, whether it's Seismic or HighSpot or any of the other many competitors, embed them into those tools. Just make sure that your salespeople can already access your content where they live all day long.
Yeah, otherwise, what will happen is you're the one that will be responding to the question of, where's the latest battle card on X? All day, every hour.
Yep. I think that there's a lot of teams that spend a lot of time dealing with ad hoc requests and questions on Slack or Teams or whatever sort of chat that you're using. Where's this? Where's that? I forget about this. I forget about that. The more accessible you can make your content and the more that you can reinforce your sales reps to go back to where battle cards always are, you are ideally trying to train them over time to be able to have more autonomy in terms of finding the information they need when they need it. So now that we have some of the basics out of the way, we want you to start thinking about how your competitive content, your battle card content, can be built to actually enable your sales reps at each step of the sales cycle. So at the beginning, the first goal is to help them to identify if there are competitors in the deal. Now, sometimes a prospect will say straight up, I'm looking at you and I'm looking at these competitors. Oftentimes they won't. So your reps have to be listening for clues and for cues, even with their language. And we need to make them better at this, because the earlier that your salespeople can identify, and even your customer success teams, but the earlier that they're able to identify that there's a competitor in a deal, the better position they are to dismiss them out of it. So the further that your prospects are getting into a deal, or your competitors are getting into a deal with you, and now your prospect is actively evaluating them, now your sales reps are faced with needing a combination of offensive and defensive tactics to beat them. Whereas early on in that deal, you have the opportunity to shape the lens from which a prospect will view a competitor's platform at the very early stages of their evaluation. Once you sort of get deeper into a deal, now you're dealing with a bunch of competitor claims that are coming up against you. You're trying to lay some seeds of doubt about a competitor as well. So really, the earlier you can deposition, the better. And basically, the deeper that your competitors get into the deal, the more information that your salespeople are going to need. But what you don't want to do is to provide all of that content up front. So those 100-slide PowerPoint decks are an overload of information and nothing will be memorable. Almost kind of hearkening back to Erin's approach to her how do you compare response. Keeping it simple, keeping it digestible and memorable goes way further than just providing all information up front. And at Clue, we call this concept breadcrumbing. So providing quick bites of information to your sales reps as they need it, and then guiding them through to deeper and deeper information as a competitor gets further in a deal. It's easier for them to digest. It's easier for them to execute on. It's just more effective. So even looking at this pyramid, it's starting by teaching your reps how to spot a competitor, then guiding them through to quick dismiss or positioning statements, then guiding them through to those offensive and defensive strategies as they need it, and giving them the ability to, for some reps who want to do a lot more research and check out all your source links and do that, provide them as links, but don't provide all the information all in one document, if that makes sense.
Hey,
And
Katie, Can I just interject here? There was a question just in regards to the customers divulging names of their competitors if they're telling the seller that they can't, and how you can get a customer to actually give you that name.
So I think there are a couple of things here, and we'll talk about this in a little bit. One is, are there specific terms that are very unique to a competitor that you can actually listen for? Because every competitor will want to differentiate and use very unique language so that they are differentiated in the marketplace, and that's usually a sign. Another thing you could also do is to just be upfront that, you know, if your prospect is saying that they are looking at other competition, you can actually be upfront and say, yeah, we know that most of the time we're going to be competing against this competitor, and this is how we're different. Kind of use that as a way to get a little bit of either acknowledgement or dismissal, and sometimes it's just hard to do. But that's what I would suggest for you to think about.
Yeah, just to build on that, I think there's a couple of considerations. So if you've asked a customer or a prospect who else they're evaluating or where they're at in terms of other competitors and they don't tell you, I think that your salespeople and your customer success people would have some pretty strong opinions about how far they would be willing to push that without eroding trust. So they might ask, but if they're not going to get an answer, they're not going to continue to push at the sake of eroding trust with that person. So what you can do, and I know what we do at Clue, is there's specific language that we'll hear in terms of like even like product language or user language, like the terminology that we use versus terminology our competitors use that can give us hints about who the competitors are. I think that there are specific claims that we'd be used to fielding depending on the competitor we're up against, or a specific conversation about features and feature functionality that we know different competitors will really like harp on because it's maybe where they feel there's a strength for themselves. So there's like a lot of clues, just touching on Vincent's point, there's a lot that you can extract by listening that could give you pretty good insight into who else they could be evaluating in a deal. That's my best advice. So just ending out this slide, there are some reps that are going to want and will want to jump to feature comparison information or pricing intel immediately. I think that myself and Vincent, probably you too, would encourage you that if your reps are selling based on features, if they think that feature comparison intel is the most important to help them in a deal, you're almost always going to be ending up in pricing battles in those deals if you're just selling based on features. So you really want to focus your efforts, at least at the beginning of building your CI program, on leveling up the ability of your sales and even CS teams to really nail that high level depositioning and to not just focus all your time on feature specific differences. Would you agree, Vincent?
I totally agree. And I would say that this is also true even for companies that are outright leaders, even from a feature set standpoint, because what's going to happen is that your competition will catch up in a very specific area or do a leap over, and just putting yourself into the feature comparison is just constantly going to become a race to the bottom, essentially.
Great. So we come up to poll number 2. It should be a select all that apply question. Answer the poll in terms of what Battlecard content you're already building for your teams. And we can answer, if there's any questions at this point, we can answer a couple of questions while we wait.
There are lots of questions, so let's pick one.
Okay.
Let's pick one. Actually, there's an interesting question. So what's the difference between weaknesses and pain points? Do you want to answer that?
I can take a stab, like competitor weaknesses versus pain points. I think yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I was actually going to say, I think it's a matter of framing. I think weaknesses is very much a matter of the competitor's weakness or vendor's weakness, whereas pain points to me are customer pain points.
Yeah.
And I think where the crossover happens is that when the inability, if the vendor's inability to meet a particular customer pain point, that is a true weakness. So maybe that's why there's the confusion or the question. That's where it comes from.
I could see if you have different buyer personas built out where they have sort of different and unique pain points, having different pain points for both yourself and your competitor are going to open up different opportunities with that prospect, right? Like if you know, it's whatever, someone in an enterprise level company and their specific pain points are very unique to being of a company of that size, you're going to talk about specific strengths relative to your competitor where you know they're going to be weak. I would think there might be opportunities to build battle cards that are going to speak to, like, actually make a connection between the pain points of that buyer and the offensive and defensive strategies that you would use against a competitor in that scenario. Would that make sense?
I think it makes sense. And I think what you have said is very true, that the best battle cards are always going to be customer centric, customer focused. You have seen a lot of battle cards that are feature centric.
Yeah.
And you're now actually talking about multiple sets of connections that a sales rep have to interpret how that's impactful to the customer, and then the customer have to interpret how that's impactful to their business. And so that's why when we're talking about customer pain points and specifically prospects pain points and the inability for a vendor to meet those pain points inside of those pain points, that's where a true weakness can be really attacked. There's another question. Katie, you will love this question.
No, I'm nervous.
How to make sure all sales reps know where the enablement content is. This is a huge problem for us, especially for new reps. This is not a setup, by the way.
It's not a setup. I mean, what are your best practice on that, Vincent? We're kind of in the process of doing that ourselves, making sure all of our reps and the new reps that we're hiring all the time are going to our central place, obviously Clue, but.
Yeah, I'll go back to my time at Hootsuite too. So one of the things that we did very upfront and early on is to work with the onboarding team for new reps. And we made sure that we have a 45-minute session with every single new hire, all customer-facing new hires. And we kind of talk about the competition at a high level, at a broad level. And at the end, I always say this one thing. I don't need you to remember a single thing I said to you today. All I need you to do is to know where to go. And here's the link to Clue. This is where we keep all of our competitive content that we've actually talked about today. Obviously, it was because I was a Clue client, but that we had this ability to be able to point everybody to a single place. But that's the most important message early on, so that you're doing two things. One is establishing trust early. And the second is to tell them that this is the only thing you need to know, that just go here, go here, go here, go here. And that's the message we kind of reinforce in every enablement session after that. One
thing that we had at least one client that did this in the past. So they actually built out in Battlecards some of their onboarding training. So they would be sending new reps into a specific Battlecard where they had embedded videos for new reps. This could be SDRs or even account executive, where they could go in and listen to call recordings from demos or from discovery calls that had been done to hear how do we talk about our competitors at high levels. So by actually using Battlecards for training, that started to, just like Vincent, you're kind of saying, your goal is to really teach them where to go to get competitive information while they're onboarding, rather than necessarily fully make sure that they understand all nuances of your competitors during onboarding, because that's probably not going to be possible. But they're going to have nuances to questions that come up over time. So your goal is sort of just to get them using and get them understanding what those access points are and where they should go whenever any competitor question comes up.
Yeah. And you have to remember, like as a new hire coming on board, they are going to be drinking from a fire hose. So in most cases, competitive enablement is going to be towards the end of that initial onboarding period. So if you're trying to cram more stuff into their brains, it won't hold. So how do you help them feel that they got what they need, and also feel relief that they don't have to try to remember something that is really important to them?
Yeah, what I try to do, so part of my role right now is managing SDR team as well. And we have onboarding, like an onboarding kind of program built up for them. They, just like you're saying, like they really are drinking from a fire hose their first month on the job. They're not going to remember, I would assume, 90% of the training that we walk them through, because it's too much at one time. But my goal is, in the way that we've structured the content, my goal is just that they they can lightly remember, oh yes, I did have a training module on that. There was a video on that. And that all they need to be able to do is find it. So if I make it super easy for them to find, 2 months down the line, when they actually need to dive deeper into that again, they can find it. That's been pretty much my goal, at least with training reps. Shall we look at poll results?
We shall.
Before we do that, can you just expand on depositioning? There's a question here asking you to define what you mean by that and how exactly sellers should deposition their competitors and what information they need to do that.
Okay. Yeah. So depositioning really means how do you put them in a different box, or think about it as, use a different term, repositioning, right? So every vendor in the marketplace will put themselves in a very specific position in the market. And the question is, what statements can you actually make to move the perception, your prospect's perception of that particular competitor into a different place? To give you an example, again, I'll go back to my Hootsuite days, where the solution that we had was actually for every marketer, every single solution, and social marketer who needs to engage with their audiences in the social networks, etc. And what our competition did really well was to put us into a box of, oh yeah, they're an SMB tool, it's not an enterprise tool, and therefore you as an enterprise should not be thinking about Hootsuite. So the reason why I use the word reposition is that now we're actually got moved into a different place, and then our reps have to spend the time to move themselves back into the position of, we're the solution for you. So that is exactly what a deposition or repositioning type of messaging would mean, and that it needs to be really short, really concise, and just super memorable, so that everything else you say, all your feature comparisons or your strengths and weaknesses that you can talk about will help to support the notion of, this is the position that they're really in, and this is not the position that they say that they are in.
I want to put you on the spot and do an example. What if I were Slack and what is our depositioning statement on how we're going to position ourselves relative to Microsoft Teams? What are your thoughts on that? What would be your approach?
Right. So, okay. So the way that we could actually position it, if I'm a Slack, and I would actually position ourselves as the communication or collaboration tool for every business. Whereas Microsoft Teams is very much just for their Microsoft Dynamics type of businesses.
Great. Done.
Right. Now, obviously, there are specific issues with it. If you know that your prospect is a Microsoft shop, then you have to take a different approach.
Yeah. Right. I mean, so there's some strategy in there in regards to you're basically saying, if you're Microsoft, you're going to be working with Microsoft Office Suite in order to, you're going to be tied to that. There's a couple of things that you're saying in there that's loaded, but without speaking negatively about the competitor at all, that you've sort of just positioned Slack as more accessible to every company, more flexible and not tied to other specific tech stack, right?
Integrated into everything that you do already, etc. And also gives me the ability to just talk about other things in the future.
Yeah. Matt, can we get the poll results?
Objection handling is number one. Not surprised about that.
Yeah.
Why we won and how we lost. Discovery questions. FUD. FUD is interesting.
Product or feature comparison, second highest after objection handling.
Landmines to lay or questions to ask.
Landmines to lar. And then interesting that, there's more pricing and discounting information than there is any of those simple, quick dismiss or high-level depositioning cards. Also interesting, maybe not surprising, that there's a lot of feature comparisons, but not a ton of more feature comparisons than there are landmines to lay or questions to ask. Landmines to lay or questions to ask are your offensive strategy, right? What are the questions you're going to ask a prospect that's going to plant a seed of doubt? As an example, what really matters to you when it comes to blah, blah, blah. It's going to plant a seed of doubt that they're going to take forward as they evaluate both tools. So it's interesting. What I'm kind of seeing here is a lot of defensive work being done with Battlecards. a lot of feature and pricing information being done, but maybe not that much offensive strategies being built through Battlecards.
Yeah, I'm not actually terribly surprised. I think this is very typical, especially the much lower number on quick dismiss and how to spot a competitor. I actually did a quick scan of some of the battle cards that I've seen, notionally, and unsurprisingly, a very small percentage have quick dismiss type of content. And I think the reason is actually fairly easy to understand. Product and feature comparisons and pricing discount type of intel are actually relatively easy to do because they are simple facts. Whereas quick dismiss and high level depositioning or even how to spot the competitors are much harder to get right, to get crisp. So when push comes to shove, it's like, well, how do I get the easiest thing to satisfy those loud voices over at sales?
Yeah, totally. I would agree. It's way harder to be able to like come up with a super concise positioning strategy, and then to work that out through messaging and battle cards and across all your marketing materials. Great. Let's move forward. So we've taken the framework that we just walked through, and we've pulled together the top types of content that you can use to build an effective battle card. So we're going to walk through this now. How exciting. We finally are showing a battle card. And really, this sort of battle card template is, it's about providing the content to help answer what we would consider like 5 key questions. The first is, how do I spot when this competitor is in a deal? And for this, we would use the how to spot or how to identify a competitor card. Really, what are the unique terms, phrases, or language your salespeople can be listening for, or the questions that they can expect to face when another competitor is in a deal? That's what you're going to put in that card. Second is, how do I differentiate from this competitor? So for this, we use the quick dismiss, again, going back to Erin's strategy. So what's the high level statement? What are some supporting points? And how do you summarize that again in a way that's going to be memorable? Your key objective here is, after your prospect walks away from a demo and they've just heard a million things about your company and your platform, what are they going to remember? What's going to be their key takeaway? How does it boil down to one sentence? So that's how you're trying to answer that question. How do you differentiate? The third is, how do I attack? And 4, how do I defend? So there are a number of different tactics and cards that you can use, but you'll need some combination of offensive and defensive strategies. So on the defensive side, objection handling is one that seems to be commonly used and that we've included here. On the offensive side, questions to ask or landmines cards both help to plant seeds in your prospect's mind that could help to put you in a stronger position as the deal moves forward. And then finally, how do they approach the market holistically? So it's valuable to provide for your salespeople some insights into what are the types of customers that are really bread and butter against this competitor for them. What can their approach in the sales process be, possible about their pricing or about pilot trials, any sort of insights that you have about how are they going to handle deals and prospects with specific types of customers? What's their approach to the market, and what can we learn from that? And then the last that we've included here are the why we win and why we lose. We did a survey a number of years ago asking salespeople actually what they felt was the most valuable information that could be included in a battle card for them. And the first, I think the most highly requested, was that high level depositioning, which was interesting for us to learn at the time. And the second was more win stories, more insights into why we lose. And the way that we've built this in this template is we've provided some high level kind of like summary points, and then we've linked out and provided additional links for the sales reps that really want to take a look through win stories, take a look at customer stories to understand more deeply. The option is there for your reps to dive deeper, again, sort of tying back to that breadcrumbing concept, but we haven't overloaded the information in the card itself. So at this point, Vincent, I'm going to pass off to you. Let me know when I can flip sort of the slides, but Vincent's going to walk through now a couple of specific examples of cards and walk you through how you can really build them.
Yeah, in I think it actually ties really well into some of the results we actually saw, because the two most important things that sales reps seems to be asking for are objection handling type of content, and also landmines that you could actually use. So I'll talk through and show you like the way that I've actually approached things, and the formula that we actually use to mix these things stick.
Great.
So here's a real live example, not necessarily live now, but here's a real example of a card, a piece of content for objection handling. And really the way I think about this is that, what is the ultimate objective of this piece of content? It is to, most importantly, increase the sales reps' confidence in their ability to respond to a particular objection. And so there's a very particular formula that I'm following, and it gets very prescriptive. And the reason why for this prescriptiveness is that objection handling is hard, and you want the reps to be able to do it, right? So you want to suggest like these are specific actions. So if you actually pay attention to the way we did things is, we start out by just being super clear about what, no, let's stay here. Yeah, super clear about what the competition actually saying about us, how you might actually hear this. And then we tell our reps to acknowledge it. Don't just outright dismiss it, because acknowledging is the way to, and the start of the trust building, right? That you want to continue to build this trust. But then after that, then you want to start to reframe it and use, and I really like to use a phrase, the way we see things and the way we see it, because it is much more about perspective. And then so you can actually reframe it and also bring the prospect into your frame of mind and how you actually look at the solution and the challenges ahead. And then once you do that, then you can start to provide specific content and share content and proof points to reinforce that position. And ultimately, I think the most important thing to think about is how do you go about iterating this with sales leaders, because this is not a one time and you're done type of deal. You are constantly going to be iterating through this, and the best person for you to work with, to collaborate with, is your sales leads, and not do this in a vacuum. Next slide. And so I really want everybody to think about like, what can you actually do? And there's a very easy way of actually tackling this. I don't know whether sales calls are going to be happening on Monday, given that it's a 4th of July weekend. But first thing it actually, when it actually happens next week, is just jump on a sales call, sit down, write down the objections as you're hearing them verbatim. Write down your sales rep's actual response, right? Don't try to interpret, don't try to come up with your response. Just write it down, write down what the rep actually said. And then the second thing for you to do is just go and say, well, based on the sales rep's actual response, do you actually have external facts or internal facts that are relevant and are supportive of that statement? If so, build the content, review the sales with a sales leader to see how that actually works. And you might actually be done, right? You can just inform the team and you'll be done with it. If the evidence doesn't actually line up, well, what do? Again, use and abuse your sales leaders, especially in the beginning of the quarter, since they're actually less busy than the end of the quarter. And really just talk to them, right? Be upfront and say, hey, this is where what the customer is actually saying, prospects actually saying, this is what our reps are actually saying. Here's the evidence that we actually have that doesn't really line up to it. How do you suggest we actually go about doing this, right? You can absolutely come up with your interpretation of this, but absolutely will collaborate and work with sales leaders so that it feels like a collaboration. And the reason why this is really important is that once the sales leader feels that there's that collaboration, they will be your voice. They will be the ones to get the reps on board to follow this objection handling tactic.
That's in part almost like stakeholder engagement work as well, just getting buy-in to the content that you're building and sort of sign off an engagement with it from sales leadership.
Yep.
An interesting thought that I had on this sort of card is to almost do a take, like let's take Erin, for example, here. I would, one thing I think would be interesting is to build a like what Erin says response, depending on the size of your sales team. But to take common objections and then to specifically listen to the responses from some of your top performing salespeople can get buy-in. My theory would be you get really great buy-in from your other sales reps on that, in that content that you've built and in the battle cards you've built, because they will respect high performers on their sales team and be naturally very curious to understand in practice, how are some of the top reps handling these calls, as opposed to just, you know, what did the product marketing or the CI team put together as a way to handle this? But if it's actually, if you can back it up by saying top reps are using this as a response, that probably adds a ton of trust building to the entire process of building your content.
Exactly. Landmine. So this is the fun stuff, right? This is what everybody, all sales reps wish that the Battlecards are just full of, right? What are all the things that you could actually use to attack your competition? Here with landmines, again, the content formula is fairly straightforward. It is whatever the landmine is, better line back up into the high level quick dismiss or the positioning for the competition. And the reason why you want to do that is, again, it's supporting that high level statement so that everything you say just continue to build and adds onto that trust. But then you also want to ensure you do this in a way to raise urgency, right? Like that's not just coming from you. It must be either from a market or a customer perspective, and make sure that you're explicit about why it matters, why it's important, why it's impactful to the customers. And then after that, again, it's just a matter of triangulating, adding a whole bunch of supporting proof points that a sales rep could actually use and share. With a landmine, I actually tend to be less prescriptive in terms of the way I actually build the content. And the reason is I don't need to, right? I don't need to spin my brain to actually think about that, because all salespeople are going to be very creative in the way that they actually use the landmines. What you need to make sure you do is you need to make sure that the landmines and supporting facts are accurate and factual. And when there are places where it's not 100% accurate or 100% proven, just be clear about it. That here is something that we have kind of heard, or that we have heard but we haven't validated. So this is what it is. This is what you can say, but be clear that this is not exactly something that we have 100% validated. And again, this is something that a sales rep can actually use in their conversation. You know, if they are open about something we've heard but we haven't really validated, it just adds on the trust that you're being transparent with the prospect. And the way overall I think about landmine is, what is the objective of this particular landmine? Is this meant to be a quote unquote a kill shot that will down a competitor in one shot? Or is this more of the notion of a distraction that forces your competition to dance and to spin their wheels to defend, right? And be clear about that. So sometimes I would actually get to be much more explicit about, this is a distraction tactic, so lay it down this way. Or this is a kill shot, so make sure you actually really focus in onto that.
Next.
Yeah. And I think like what I want everybody to take away in terms of the way you think about Battlecards is, think about it as a product marketer, which means be really clear about your target audience, which is your sales reps, your customer facing teams, your customer success, your customer support, your executives, your partner teams. There's a question in here about, do you differentiate Battlecard content based on customer success versus sales? Absolutely. The content itself might be very similar, or sometimes even identical, or at least blocks of it might be identical, but the way that you organize things will be different. And then the way that you set things up need to be fairly differentiated and specific. So give you a really good example. Customer success, you know, if it's a customer success team that is very much focused on customer adoption, user adoption, then a lot of that content is probably much more on the, how do you identify a competition coming in? How do you have a quick dismiss and a quick way of describing competition? And also then much more focus on the feature functionality comparison side of things. Whereas on a sales rep, then it might be much more towards the positioning and the perception and the perspective that you want to be focused on, the vision side of things that you want to be focused on. And the second thing to think about is, think like a marketer. So Katie was saying that, how do we go about using simple, concise language? And this is something I'm constantly working on. I know that Katie and I, we have this conversation all the time, because I tend to use language that might be less than simple. But again, the notion here is just to use simple, concise, memorable, and really targeted messaging. That's a second takeaway. And the third is, it doesn't, just start. It doesn't have to be a overblown, a lot of work involved. Take what you have and just iterate. There's another question in here earlier that was about what was the frequency to update battle cards and content for it? Is it better to update on a very regular basis or do it more of an ad hoc style? And I would actually say it is actually a combination of both that you need to communicate. It's all about communication. One is just communicate. What do you expect in terms of updates on a regular basis? And second is when you have information that are coming in, how do you update that quickly and then make sure that everybody knows about it? Something to add to it, and something that is really hard to do, especially in terms of if you're using a document or presentation deck as your battle card, is give the notion of what has been updated. And the reason why that's important is that, again, this is the trust building side of things. That for you as a product marketer or CI person, you need to build the trust with the, ensure you're building the trust with your sales team so that they know the stuff that they're looking at is fresh, it's relevant. Even if it hasn't really changed, you need to be able to show that this is still relevant. And with a PowerPoint deck or a document, the best you can do is just say that this entire document was updated this past month. And then when a sales rep actually looks at a piece of blog or a piece of content they have seen before, then they, in their minds, they'll think, well, this hasn't changed, so nothing else in this battle cards has changed. I'm going to ignore it forever and ever.
Yep. Fair. Were you done? We have it is the end of the hour. So I think Vincent and I can stay on for a couple extra minutes if there's some questions, but otherwise definitely thank you for joining us today. And we'll be sharing out deck and presentation later on. But are there any final questions that we could answer while we're still here?
There are quite a few other questions.
Great.
There's a question in here about, is there a strategy specifically for a customer facing battle card? That's a loaded one.
Yeah. Run
That
with
is
that
a loaded
question.
one. I will run with it. I don't think it's a customer-facing battle card that you should be sharing. I think there is a time and a place for a customer-facing piece of collateral that is about you and the competition. And then the question really comes down to, are you comparing yourself and showing a piece of asset that is you against the entire general set of competition in terms of why a prospect should choose you over the competition as a whole, or are you going specific to a single competitor? And I can't answer I can't give you a direct answer in terms of why you would choose one over another. I think you have to make that decision on your own. But I think in terms of an overall strategy is customer-centric, customer-centric, customer-centric. Make everything on that piece of content specific to your customers and prospects, and not just what you interpret as strengths and weaknesses, because perceived strengths and perceived weaknesses might not be all that important to a prospect in their decision making.
Fair. We do take an approach at Clue where we definitely don't believe or buy into talking negatively about a competitor. So I think the way that we wouldn't build necessarily like a battle card on a competitor that we would share with a customer. That's just not really our approach to sales. Maybe Vincent, correct me if I'm wrong. I think that what we try to focus on are our strengths, and then tactical sort of depositioning and like getting our salespeople to leverage strategies within their sales cycle, but it would rarely take the form of being like explicit in ever talking negatively about a competitor, because that can erode trust with prospects, and that's the last thing that we want to do. Exactly.
And feature side-by-side comparisons is the classic ask from sales reps. You will always get that, irrespective of how hard you push back on it. And I've actually taken a different approach with it, which is to use emojis as responses as a comparison, just for fun. Again, the notion here for us here was to open up conversation, right? Have a real conversation about why we use this particular emoji over another one. So that was my strategy for that.
Final question.
Yes, it is. There is another question in here about, traditionally, product marketing is responsible for sales battle cards. Should product marketing also be responsible for CSMs and partner battle cards and partner facing battle cards? Katie, I'll let you
I
answer
would
that.
say yes. Like, I mean, as a product marketer, if you're building sales battle cards, it's because your objective is to increase your competitive win rate. That should go straight through to increasing the like logo retention and sort of like avoid churn going to competitors. Sort of exact same concept, and a lot of the tactics would be very similar. It would seem like a very natural extension if you've gone through the exercise of building your sales battle cards against competitors to tweak and iterate on that to make it accessible for your all customer facing teams. That would be my take, 100%.
Agreed, agreed. I think it's a case of you've already done it for your salespeople, and it's not that difficult to make a variant for CSMs and partner teams, and you don't want them to, you don't want other people to reinvent the wheel and redo things, right? So there's either a collaboration that can actually happen, or you can just take ownership of it and actually build it. I actually think about it in terms of like product marketing and their KPIs. If the KPI is on retention and adoption and also in terms of revenue retention, well, that's a natural need for you to work with the CSMs and for the partner teams as well.
Yep, similar, just going back to, it's like anyone that is facing customers should be basically armed and briefed on how to talk about competitors. So I would even say your event teams, or if you have field marketing teams that are hosting events or going to trade shows or conferences, similarly, you would be taking some of your high level battle card content and enabling them with it. I'm literally at trade shows and events talking about how we are different than competitors. So I definitely am eager for that content. For sure.
Okay, there are actually a couple questions that kind of center around one theme. And the question is really around, are all battle cards all or nothing, or is it common to have a few complete battle cards and a couple of battle card light versions? Related question is, we have a lot of tiers of competition. So how do I deal with that?
First of all, I would say this is a hugely common question that we get, and we should almost think about doing a webinar that talks about structuring battle card content and all the different ways that it can be done. I can answer really briefly, and Vincent, you probably have way better insight to me, but I'd say there are probably absolutely competitors you're going to do different depths of content building for. Your tier one competitors, you're obviously going to build a lot more deeper content, have a light version of battle cards for some of those up and comers or ones that are faced infrequently or that you naturally are just able to beat without much enablement support. Yes. I don't know if you have more to add to that.
And I think the way you want to think about things is that you're in direct competition, your adjacent markets where they're not real competition, but it can come up. You definitely want to arm your sales team with something to talk about them. So that might simply take the form of a quick dismiss type of content for every vendor that might actually come up. So that's definitely not a complete battle card, but it would live in a battle card of sorts above this other adjacent category.
I would say as a leader of a CI program, part of your role is also to identify how those threats, your competitor threats, are changing over time and which are impacting the most revenue for the company, and allocating your resources based on changes to that within your market. So part of the role is being able to identify, where do we sit in the market right now, which threats are emerging, which are costing us money as a business, how am I going to, on a quarterly basis or monthly basis, allocate resources on my team to focus on different competitors where needed. It should be like an always changing thing.
Exactly. And I think one thing I'll add here about completeness of battle cards as well. So the question on, does a battle card need to be fully 100% complete before it gets rolled out to sales? I think historically it needed to be because a document that looks incomplete or a document that looks like it's half finished can't actually go out because people kind of just ignore it and assume that it will be done later on. When battle card content is actually digital, I think it actually opens up something else, which is the ability for you to open up a piece of content and says, we actually don't have information on this, and that we need your help to gather information on this. That is how we also can modernize the CI practice to make it much more of a two-way street, so that there's a feeling of collaboration, and there's also a lot more of the buy-in in terms of sales reps looking at the content and say, I contribute to this, and therefore I can actually make more and more use of the content coming off the product marketing with CI teams.
Great.
Okay, well, there's still quite a few more questions. Do we want to go through all of them?
Maybe we can do like one more, and then maybe we could try to follow up in an email actually with answers to some of these questions.
Okay, so one question here is, what is the optimal length of a battle card? And do you have any recommendations on how to curate what's on a battle card? We're routinely finding that we have more valuable intel and information that we can efficiently convey to our GTM teams in a maximum of 3 to 4 pages. Any longer, and it seems to seem overwhelming.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, so what was the beginning question?
What is the optimal length of a battle card, and do you have any recommendations on how to curate on what's on a battle card?
Interesting. What I'm hearing is maybe it sounds like it's in like a document form. That's what I'm interpreting from that question. Yeah, so at Clue, we use like a system of cards basically, and we would say you would pair together anywhere from like 8 to 10 cards. That would be an ideal size of a battle card. It's kind of like the template that I showed you before. Again, I would like encourage you to make use of the concept of breadcrumbing and linking out to further information as opposed to providing all of it in one document. So like a 3 to 4 page document, again, your sales rep is going to breeze through that. What are the key takeaways you want them to remember? And how can you take a look at that document, cut it down to 1 page, ideally, where like a couple of core messages are really going to get across this in a strong way? And how can you link out to further information so that people who want to dive further can dive further? Remember, like anyone reading a 3 or 4 page document, when they end their day, now they've gone home and they had dinner, what are they going to remember that? Like, that's what we're always trying to remember, is what's going to be their takeaway from it, because we want it to be memorable. And I would argue a 3 to 4 page document becomes very difficult for it to be memorable, and probably not all of that information needs to be memorized. Some of it will be fine if they're diving into it in their deals when they need to, when it comes up, like technical details or specific product stuff doesn't need to be memorized, but some of those core concepts and strategies on how to navigate that competitor do. Your thoughts?
I think that's why we're pushing towards a much more digital, much more modern version of battle cards, because documents and presentation decks have their limitations.
Mm-hmm. You know what we should do here, Vincent? If there's more questions or if anyone else has any to add in, you and I could record a second video, actually just going through all of them, that we can share out to all the people who registered for this webinar. That could be really useful. Yeah. If there are still, I can't really see. So if there's still a number of them.
There are quite a few of them. Okay. But to answer your earlier question, Sarah actually says yes for a webinar about structuring battle cards and content.
Okay, great. Okay, well, everyone, thank you very much for participating in this. This has been great. All of these every time we do a webinar on battle cards, there's so much engagement and obvious questions because people want to dive deeper. So let's try to do that. We'll try to come up with some new, some follow-up webinars and content pieces that can help to dive deeper and answer all these questions. Again, reach out to Vincent and I on LinkedIn if you have different topics that would be helpful for us to cover in upcoming webinars. We love hearing about that, and we're more than game to help elevate everyone's battle cards.
Great to everyone join.
Okay, thanks. Everyone take care.